Welcome, everyone. My name is Shelley Murphy, and this is the International African American Museum, and I am with the Center for Family History. We are welcoming you to this Saturday genealogy series webinar. The first photograph that you see here is a glimpse of what have been built and is opening in January 21st, 2023. The road to opening day has started. We have opportunities for people to become members, charter members. You are welcome to visit the website, which you see the URL there at the bottom of the slide. And for this, you are welcome to take photographs of this slide if you would like to. And if not, just visit, ask any questions at the end. The Center for Family History at the International African American Museum is live. You are welcome to visit, interact there. And also, as of today, as you see, we have the monthly genealogy webinars, and we all want to thank you for being here today. So what resources are available through the Center for Family History is the blogs, the United States Colored Troops pension records, resources, mentoring for community preservation projects, resources for family reunions, workshops like this one on research, writing, and publishing your own family stories, and also preserving family treasures. A few reminders about the webinar today. As you know, this session is being recorded and available at a later time on IAAM's YouTube channel. Please keep yourself muted during the interview or the presentation. If you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A box, and we'll have the panel respond to them when we are done. Questions, again, please place them in that Q&A box. So for more information, there are the websites, and you're welcome to take a photograph of this slide. You've got the Center for Family History website, the main International African American Museum website, and then of course, if you're interested and have questions regarding membership, it will all be on the website as well. So again, opening day is January 21st, 2023, and we are so excited. So I'm going to welcome our guests, which is going to be Bernice Alexander Bennett, Dr. Mary Kay Clark, Lyle Gibson, Denise Griggs, Maurice Jenkins, Margot Williams, and Angela Walton Raji, which I did not put her name on the list. So she's going to get me for that one. But anyway, I'm going to stop sharing right now and let Bernice take over and give a background on the Homestead Act.
Well, Shelley, I'd like to thank you for inviting us to talk about this topic that I feel needs to be talked about. Our goal is to create awareness and to find as many Black homesteaders as we can throughout the United States. And so I'm going to share my screen and my slides and then get started. So we're going to talk about the Black homesteaders of the South. But before we get to the Black homesteaders of the South, I'm going to give you some background information on the Homestead Act of 1862, which was signed by Abraham Lincoln on May 20th, 1862. Now, this act actually went into effect January 1st, 1863, with the first homesteader, Daniel Freeman, homesteading in Nebraska, Beatrice, Nebraska, to be specific. But this act had some requirements. First of all, to be eligible to apply for land, and I want to tell you, we are talking about up to 160 acres of land. Can you imagine just putting your mind around 160 acres. I think that's the size of a football field. But in order to be eligible, you should never take up arms against the United States. Former slaves, immigrants, and women could file. You had to show evidence of improvements, and the individual had to be over the age of 21. Now, there was an application process. People didn't just go out and say, this is my 160 acres of land. No, they had to settle on the land. They had to file an application. They had to improve the land and live on that land for a minimum of 5 years. And then they had to file for a patent or deed of title. Now, I want you to take a very close look at this map, because all of the states in this map are homestead public land states. Those that are blue, those are not public land states. And I just want to say what those states are. The 13 original colonies, Kentucky, Maine, Tennessee, Texas, West Virginia, and Hawaii were never part of the federal public domain states. And I'm saying that because I do have people that will write me, well, what about Texas? Well, what about Georgia? Well, what about Kentucky? Those are not public land states. However, I want to take you to another act. And this is an act called the Southern Homestead Act. Now, I'm putting this out because I want you to know there was a period of time in which there was an act that was really seeking poor whites and formerly enslaved people. But it was a short period of time where folks could apply. Now, what happened with this act is the Freedmen Bureau for some people. And they had already signed labor contracts, which made it very difficult for formerly enslaved people to turn around and apply for this land because they signed the labor contracts. Now, this act only lasted, let's say 10 years. People could get up to 80 acres and later 160 acres of land. And it was in the southern states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Florida, and I didn't say Alabama, and Alabama. But let's go back. While it was repealed, it didn't mean that the southern states were not still eligible. They were. So let's take it to another level now. One of the things that the goal for individuals was to get a land patent. That means they could get up to 160 acres of land. Now, these patents are the legal documents that transferred land ownership from the United States government to individuals. And one way to find out about these patents is to go to the Bureau of Land Management. Now, the federal land patents offered researchers a source of information on the initial transfer of land titles from the federal government to individuals. In addition to verifying title transfer, this information will allow you, the researcher or individuals, to really see what's happening here, because you can see legal land descriptions. You can see the time that land was actually given. And then there are a variety of land patents. They include cash entry. Yes, people did purchase the land. Homestead, these were the people that had to live on that land for about a minimum 5 years, and they had to do a lot of other things with it. And then there were military warrant patents. So you can find this information on the Bureau of Land Management site. So let me take you to the next place you need to go. You need to actually search if your ancestors lived in any of those states that I shared with you in brown. Those in brown, and you know that they may have owned land, the next step is for you to find the information. So this is my ancestor, Peter Clark. Peter Clark lived in Louisiana in a parish called Livingston Parish. So here I am on the Bureau of Land Management website, and I have now started my search process. The search process brought up a lot of information. One of the things it showed me was that Peter Clark did receive a land patent in 1896. Now, some of you will find these land patents on Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, Family Search, or your family may have a land patent. They may have the actual document, which is so exciting if you have that. But let me tell you about the land entry case files. If you find a patent, understand this is the end of the process, which means your ancestor did everything they were supposed to do in order to qualify for that land. And so what you will have to do once you found that information on the Bureau of Land Management is to request a land entry case file. And the land entry case files are held at the National Archives. Now, can you imagine getting a case file with information on your ancestor? Well, this is just the cover of Peter Clark's homestead application. I'm not going to go through the whole application, but I hope you see a dollar amount at the bottom of this application. Yes, he had to pay a filing fee. He had to pay an $18 filing fee, and he went to the land office in New Orleans in 1887. Now, I mentioned to you that he received his land patent in 1896, which means that you could almost use this information, you can use it as a substitute for the 1890 census. Just think about that. But what did it take? Just think of what did it take for somebody to actually get through this whole process? They needed resources. Yes, you saw $18, and I wanted you to see that because everybody is paying a filing fee. They're not buying the land, but remember, they are applying, and you go through some things when you apply, and he had to put down a filing fee. They need farm tools. How in the world are they going to clear and cultivate land for 5 years without having farm tools? So they required resources. They had to clear and live on that land. They also had to have community support. And this is something that you will find in those applications. You will find the names of individuals that served as witnesses for your ancestor. So I'm going to move to another place now, because you may be wondering, well, how did this whole Black Homesteaders of the South book come about? Well, it came about through the Homestead National Historical Park in Nebraska. They have a Black Homesteading in America project. And the Homestead National Historical Park was seeking descendants of Black homesteaders to tell their stories. Now, the Black Homesteaders Project actually grew out of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln Center for the Great Plains, where they documented 6 Black homesteading communities in several locations. And I'm hoping that you will definitely go to this site to learn more about the Black Homesteaders Project. But one thing that needed to happen is that we needed to expand this project. And by expanding this project, it required education, and getting out there to get others to start looking for their ancestors that own land. Now, how do you know that you are a descendant of a homesteader? You may have been told through oral history that your ancestor owned land. I know I was told by my grandmother that her grandfather owned a lot of land. You may have actually lived or visited the family farm, but it never dawned on you that that person was a homesteader. Actually, it didn't even dawn on me that my great-great-grandfather was a homesteader until I started the next process, which the genealogical research, which is what all of you will have to do to take it to that next level. So what do these stories tell us? Well, in the book, The Black Homesteaders of the South, before I even tell you about the book, I want to tell you that stories began to come in from descendants. Not all of the stories are from the South. We had Shelley Murphy. I call her the Supergirl. She had stories out of Michigan. Yes, her ancestors owned land in Michigan. We received a story I call Joyce Ann Gray. Wonderful. Nebraska. Catherine Meehan Bond. Wonderful stories. Nebraska. Erica Lusko. Oklahoma. So folks, people all over can tell those stories if you're in those public land states. And I received an email today from a Seattle, Washington homestead descendant, a cash entry. So people are out there and we just need folks to start telling their stories. Well, I noticed there was a trend in the number of stories coming in for publication on the National Park Service website. And after looking at those stories, I said, wait a minute, we have a lot of stories, and reached out to the descendants to ask, would you be willing to put your story in a book? And they said yes, which resulted in 49 stories written by descendants of homesteaders from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Now, you'll see that there are various stories in here. You'll have people telling about their ancestors that were formerly enslaved. You will also have folks talking about maybe they were free people of color or were members of the United States colored troops. You will see widows, and you will see women that were not widows but applied for this land. And you will also learn about the varying communities where these homesteaders reside. So I am excited about this book, and I want to encourage all of you, when you have an opportunity, to purchase this book and to learn more from the Black homesteaders of the South. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Shelley.
Thank you for that, Bernice. That was fabulous overview. I just want to remind folks to put your Q&A or your questions into the Q&A box because the chat is not enabled at this time. So one of the first things I'd like to do is ask a question. And that would be, and I'm going to start with Dr. Clark because she's the first person in the box next to me, is basically, and this is going to come to each of you to be able to share this question. How did you get started with the interest of this homestead or homesteaders within your family? And Dr. Clark, I'll go to you and then it goes to Lyle.
Well, thank you, Dr. Murphy. And I just have to say how honored I am to be a part of this panel. And three of the people who are responsible for me being in this panel are on this panel. So that's where my story starts with this conversation. So first I have to give all the glory and honor to Miss Bernice Bennett for spearheading this project, because she is a warrior on a mission, and it wouldn't happen without her tenacity. So thank you. And to Angela Walton Raji, it was in a group that I am pleased to be a part of, where she asked the question, do any of your relatives have land? And so, Angela, thank you for asking those questions, because that's what got me connected to this project. And of course, Dr. Shelley Murphy, I wouldn't be in this conversation had I not been a part of the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute, otherwise known as Maggie, because that's where I sat in one of your sessions and learned about so what and follow the neighbors and ask those questions. So that's how it got started here. But it really started in the 1960s when I was a kid. And there was this picture that I saw on the wall of my grandfather, Joe Kyle's, every time I went to his home. And this picture looked at me, I looked at it, and I asked no questions. But it was that picture that led to me being a part of this homestead conversation. Is this when you'd want me to show the picture, Dr. Shelley?
You are welcome to go ahead and show it if you'd like at this time, and then we'll turn it over to Lyle.
Okay, this is the picture that has been in my life all of my life.
Wow.
And these are the people who I didn't know who they were, but I know who they are now, which is John Henry Kyles and his wife, Frances Fanny Eddings Kyles. And they are my homesteader that are in the book. And I only followed up on them because the question was asked, and because one of my relatives, Aunt Carrie Bell Kyles, told me a story that her father owned some land. And so from 1960, when I saw this picture, to 1990, when Aunt Carrie Bell told me about the land, to 2021, when I sat in Maggie, and in October of last year, when Angela asked me the question, that's how I became connected to this project.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. I'm going to pass it on to Lyle Gibson right now. How did you get started with your interest in homesteaders?
First, thank you, Dr. Shelley, for hosting this forum. Thank you, Bernice, for spearheading this project, and to everyone else on this panel. Mine is somewhat twofold also. As a kid, you grow up hearing all these stories, going out to farmland, and the family owned the land. But it wasn't until I started to work on genealogy and family history about 30 years ago that I started to really trace the family through land records. And then my introduction to some of those land patents that were issued directly from the federal government. But what brought me to this point was Bernice and social media. And when she posted information about this project, about Black Homesteaders, I just decided to go all in. And I have a few collateral lines of ancestors that purchased land through the Homestead Act. And so pretty much that's what led me to this. So thank you, Bernice, once again.
Awesome. Denise Griggs, you can come off mute.
Well, I got started years ago. I saw a picture on the wall in Mississippi and I wanted to know who it was. And my great aunt said, she told me who it was, but she didn't know very much about him. And I asked my mother, I said, do you know who this is? She says, nope, never heard of him. And my auntie, she was there and she said she'd never heard of him. So my great aunt told me what she knew about him. And I said, oh, because I thought it was the white guy in the picture. And she said, no, that was her uncle and her great uncle. And I told her, I said, oh my God, I have to know who this man is and the background and everything. So I met different people on the internet and they were very helpful and they sent me information. And her name is Sandra Craighead. She emailed me and she said, this must be your relative. And she had so much information about him, which I will forever thank her for. And so I told her, I said, I have a reward for you. She says, oh, don't send me any money. I says, I'm not going to send you any money. I'm going to send you a picture of Peter Hunt. That was my ancestor. And so I started writing a book, and I met Bernice in DC at NARA, and she showed me how to look up the pension files. And then later on, you know, I knew he had, my ancestor, Peter Hunt, had land, but I thought he purchased it. So Bernice says, no, was it a homestead? And I was like, well, what's a homestead? And so, I mean, I just owe you everything for that, Bernice, because not only did I find Peter Hunt's homestead, this is in Mississippi, I found his mother's homestead, which was, her name was misspelled. And not only that, I began to find the other people that I put in the book, they were all interrelated. And it solved mysteries, it uncovered secrets, and there's even more that I need to finish transcribing. So thank you, Bernice, very, very much. I just could never repay you.
Another amazing story. So Margot, and then we'll go to Maurice and then Angela. So Margot Williams.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much. Yes, Shelley, thank you so much for putting this panel together. But certainly all praise to Bernice for encouraging all of us to submit our stories and suggesting that we do this book. It's been an amazing journey, and she's been a fearless leader for sure. I actually, well, let's see, the primary ancestor that I always think of when I think of our family homestead land is my great grandfather. And down there on the corner of Dr. Clark's picture in the right-hand corner, you can see a woman. Yes, and that's my grandmother, his daughter. So I knew that they owned land since I was a child. I knew that they owned land in Florida, but only in starting genealogy, learning about how to do genealogy research in the 1980s, did I learn about such things as homestead land. And I acquired the papers and thought it was interesting and thought no more of it and filed them away. And then one day Bernice is saying, did your family have homestead land? And I'm like, well, yeah. What's the big deal? And she's like, oh no, it's a big deal. And so through the project and through the National Park Service, and then realizing it really is a big deal, that's how I got involved. And I took another look and realized that one of his witnesses was his brother-in-law's father-in-law, and I got into those papers, and that's another story in the book. And I did also have the papers, so that's my father's maternal side, and on his paternal side, there is another set of homestead, another homestead claim for my great-great-grandfather, and I have those papers, and I have that story in the book as well. And my great-grandfather did actually file. I have the papers, but he did not perfect the claim.
All right, thank you for that. Maurice and then Angela.
Hi, thank you so much. I know everyone's been thanking Dr. Shelley and Bernice, and it's just really deserved. So I have to add to those things because again, it really does start with me being a fan of Dr. Shelley and Bernice and Angela Walton-Raji from the Black Pro-Gen days.
Yes.
I've been following everything that the three of them do on YouTube. All right, you're wearing a shirt.
Fabulous, Angela.
Yes, so I was watching a video of Miss Bernice talking about the homesteading as she has been doing for over 10 years at this point. But she happened to show the patent in this video, and I had never really paid attention to what that was and what it meant. But I was like, wait, I have one of those from my ancestor, Vandy Hutchins. And I didn't really ever pay attention to what, the process might have been for him to get to that patent. Vandy, I don't have a photo of Vandy. I don't have any oral history about Vandy. He was an ancestor that I did not know anything about for the most part. A lot of our family didn't even know he lived in Alabama, which is where his land was, because he lived in Georgia, and he died in Georgia. He spent 30 years in Georgia, and that's where most of my family, we have always considered our ancestral home here in America. But he was born in Alabama, and he was a homesteader, along with his father-in-law. I realized, oh, I have another patent. His father-in-law was also a homesteader. Then I realized that his father-in-law's mother-in-law was also a homesteader, a Black woman that had her own land, and that family still has the land today. In fact, her name was Lucy McGowan, and if you go to where her land is on the map, it says McGowan Street right there. So, it's really, really powerful for me to find that, because I really had no idea. And now I just know so much more about these ancestors that were almost lost to me. But they've been found now. So thank you again, Miss Bernice.
All right. Again, amazing. Thank you. Angela.
Well, hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. And of course, I will repeat the thank yous to Bernice. And of course, thank you, Shelley, for hosting this and to be around other homesteader descendants. This is absolutely amazing. My story is an interesting one because it's one of where, and you've heard the old expression, you cannot see the forest for the trees. And my own experience was one, I was just looking at the tree, and the tree being just a picture of my great-grandfather, Lewis Mitchell Bass, Sevier County, Arkansas. And I need to talk to Lyle at some point to see if our ancestors knew each other, because I think they probably did out of Sevier County. But I had always been aware that my great-grandfather had some land. My grandmother, I interviewed her before she passed away back in the 1970s. And she always said, yeah, Papa had land. He had so much land. There were even some white folks living on his land. And which I thought was, that's interesting. But okay, Papa had land. She had had land until after she married my grandfather, and then she had sold her parcel of land. But that was always kind of known. But the word homesteader wasn't registering. So I'm just looking at this little branch of this tree, great-grandpa Lewis Mitchell Bass. Okay, he had some land. And the time when I had interviewed my grandmother, she had mentioned, of course, that her father had owned land. And I had asked her other questions because my grandmother would often read a lot of passages in the Bible. Grandma, where'd you learn how to read? Well, I went to a little country school in Horatio. And in fact, my oldest brother, Bud, we call him Bud Bass. His real name is Irving. And he was a teacher in the little country school. Okay, fact, little branch of the tree, but I don't see the forest. And so I guess probably more than 15 years ago, whenever the Bureau of Land Management put up their site, and I see something about land, and I see, search for your ancestors. So I click on and I see something. Oh, there's Ellen. That's my great-grandfather, maybe. Click on it, and sure enough, it is. He had actually made a cash payment for 40 acres of land. Oh, there's Irving. That's Uncle Irving. Wait a minute. So I clicked on it. So I got these lovely certificates. I didn't know it was the end of a process. I just thought, oh, isn't this pretty? Look. And I could share it with the cousins. Hey, see this pretty certificate? This is when our folks got that land in Sevier County. And that was it. Fast forward a few years, I don't know if it was at Roots Tech or it was at one of the national genealogical events. And I think, of course, I'm always running into Bernice somewhere. And she said, girl, did you get your map? I'm like, what map? Oh, I got this map. And I'm sure some of you may have been there and remember the Bureau of Land Management had a booth. And if you could find your ancestor on their database, they could actually print a map for you, lovely map. And they would also print out the land patent on something that looked like parchment paper. Real nice. Okay. It's still part of the tree. I don't see the forest. And so fast forward up to the last year and a half or so. And of course, now I was in touch. I don't even know how I first got in touch with the folks in Nebraska, but I had spoken with Jessica, in fact, and she said, oh, yes. Oh, your folks were homesteaders. In fact, I'm on one of the videos there on their site. I still don't see the forest yet. And well, yeah, I guess they were homesteaders. Okay, now the word is kind of in my head. but I'm seeing a few more trees. Oh, where I'm out in the woods. I don't realize I'm in the forest yet. And then I start talking more with Bernice, and it starts to really click. And she's, telling me more about what she's finding, conversations that she's had with people in Nebraska as well. And it becomes obvious that, wait a minute, this land patent, so it's clicking. He was a homesteader. Uh-oh, now it's clicking. Keep in mind, all I had was the certificate. I never had the land entry papers. And conversations with Bernice during this time, well, the land entry papers really give you the details. And I noticed that she began to, encourage people, share your stories. And I kept saying, I really need to do that. So finally I said, you know what? I think I need my land entry papers. And then it really, really clicked that, number one, some of the details that my grandmother had shared with me about her father and about her oldest brother, Uncle Irving, it clicked more than ever. She mentioned that he was a teacher in the little country school. It never dawned on me, well, okay, he had to learn how to read and write. He was like one of the first children born free after enslavement had ended. Well, how did he learn how to read and write? And how did he become a teacher in the little country school? Believe it or not, the land entry papers revealed that to me. And when Bernice had gotten the papers, and she's like, girl, you better look at this. I see something in there I've never seen. So I'm reading the land entry papers, and they ask the questions. Have you cleared the land? Have you made improvements? Do you live upon the land? And one of the statements was that, well, I live there several months of the year, except when I'm away at school. Now, this is 1880 something, and I'm reading 1882 or 83. And I'm thinking, away at school? Wait a minute. In Sevier County, Arkansas, where would you have gone away at school? Now, looking at Arkansas history, I realized, well, there were not that many schools for people of African descent in the state of Arkansas. Well, there's Arkansas A&M, which is what we know it as, in Pine Bluff, which is a little bit of a distance from Sevier County. Could he have gone there? So I did a little bit of the history of Arkansas A&M, which is now the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. But I looked at the history and realized up until, early 20th century, it was actually known as Branch Normal College. Okay, I did a Google search, Branch Normal College, and on the Library of Congress, I found an 18 something, I don't remember what year it was, a yearbook. And it was a yearbook, and it did not have, as we think of yearbooks with pictures, but it mentioned the students who attended Branch Normal College. And there was Irving Bass from Sevier County. Holy cow. I'm not only realizing, that this young man in his 20s was clearing land, making improvements on the land, and getting a college education. I had always thought those in our generation were the first ones in that line, in that branch, to receive a college education. And I was wrong. Oh my goodness, this man was an educator. In later years, when he was more mature and he had decided to migrate out west and had eventually sold his parcel of land, we're talking now the 1930s and 40s, he moved to Arizona, and he moved to Phoenix area where a lot of the cousins now live. And I was surprised. I decided to just look at his headstone. And on his headstone was his name, of course, and the years in which he lived, and the fact that he was an educator. And it said teacher, father, grandfather. And I was just amazed to realize, wow, I had never even gotten those. I had the land patent for years, but had never gotten the land entry papers that told me a whole lot more about this man, who was a young man who was physically strong enough to clear land, put improvements, put a house upon the land, and also wanted an education. So this totally opened the doors. And I realized he was not only part of a movement to become a literate person, but he was his own man and was a homesteader, and what that meant. And I am just so thrilled that thanks to Bernice, who kept saying, when you gonna get your land entry papers, you want them? And I'm like, yeah, I guess I do, yeah. And then to have a totally new aspect of my family's history that I never ever knew. And this is, although I had those land patents, oh, isn't it pretty certificate, but never knew what it meant. So thanks to just talking and listening to a friend and a colleague whom I dearly respect, Bernice, so much has been opened up. And I think that now other people, because of what Bernice has really done, have had the trajectory of their family's research. Well, I won't say it's been altered, but certainly it has been expanded. And so thank you, Bernice. It's an honor to be a part of this project.
It's interesting that all of you have shared a piece of information that was not totally known within your family. And for us all as researchers, that's critical for us. And I too shared my story. I grew up every summer spending on homestead land and didn't even know what that meant. We knew about the property being there, but until Miss Bernice and Peter Clark entered my life at a Maggie she was presenting, did I understand and get a whiff of what I needed to start digging on as far as the homestead. So I'm throwing this question out to all of you, and anyone that wants to answer, please do. But why would or should African Americans be interested in homesteading lands? We heard information that Angela just shared about her ancestor and the acknowledgement of him going to college as well. She wouldn't have known that information if she wouldn't have seen that whole land entry package. So again, whoever wants to go first, why should this go? And Bernice, let's give you the platform to respond to this first, and then we'll let the others respond, whoever would like to. Why is it so important for us to know this?
You know, I look at it as the ultimate freedom for our ancestors, especially people that have known that their ancestors were enslaved, but they did move forward. It showed the resilience. You see, we came from some smart people, and these smart people were paying attention. And so they understood when others were getting that land, they were going to do the same thing. Because let me tell you all something. Race is not listed on any of the applications, nor is gender. So they could apply for that land, and they went to whatever land office they needed to go. And they settled, they could say, I settled on the land. This is what I did. Then I cultivated it. And then, which I have found to be the best part, is what they did. How many acres they cultivated for the number of seasons. What did they build on the land? Can you imagine? This is primary documentation that you would not see anywhere. Anywhere. So if you even have a thought that your ancestor was a homesteader, you need to get that land entry paper, because you are going to be exposed to information that you would not get anywhere else. It's not on the census. What you find on the census is the name of your ancestor, his occupation, a farmer, and you will see they own land, but you don't see anything else. What you find out as a homesteader is you get the details that you would not get at all. And let me just add, you also get, you know, I talked about the community, you get witnesses. You find out who your ancestors were interacting with, because they also have to testify on behalf of the claimant to prove that they have done what they were supposed to do, that they met all the qualifications and guidelines. So this is one of the reasons why I really, really push and encourage people to look for their ancestors' land. Because there's also a much bigger story that goes with that. You know, it's one thing to find the land, it's the next thing to find out what happened to the land. And some of the descendants in this book will tell you they still own their land. Others will tell you other things. So you have stories to read, again, from Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi. And Louisiana and Mississippi have the largest number of stories. But you will also find, thanks to Margot Lee Williams and Fallon Goff, you will find over 100 untold stories of Black homesteaders in Florida. Can you imagine having this only book that has ever been written telling you about other homesteaders? This is something that I believe everyone should try to find their homestead ancestor.
I love the term, we were there. We own land, we were there. So anyone else want to respond to the question why it's important for African Americans to know about homesteading and to seek out if any of their ancestors own land? Just go ahead, Margot.
Shelley, I think
Oh, go ahead.
I think for me, since we already, we were fortunate enough to have a tradition of knowing that we were a landowning family, so that wasn't a surprise for me. Probably the biggest benefit, and I think for others, is really learning about like you say, the community, the friends and relations, through the witnesses and the witness testimonies. So this the witness on my great-grandfather's claim, and my great-grandfather had been a witness for him. It turned out for this other person, Henry, makes it easier if I use the name Henry. Henry had gotten ill and wasn't able to make his filing deadline, and they were going to cancel his papers. Well, he had over 20 people in the community sign a petition begging the government to not cancel his claim. And in those names, I found my great-great-grandfather's name. And I learned more about the people who were supportive of his claim. In another set of witness testimony for the other great-grandfather that I mentioned, Alex, 2 of his daughters went to college with my grandmother at what has now become Florida A&M, but was then Florida Normal. So, and I had seen their names my grandmother had kept, and it had come down to us, her autograph book from those times. And I had seen their names, again, meant nothing. It was just like, oh, isn't that interesting? They're those people. And now I'm seeing all these connections and interconnections and realizing this is a community of people, even if they weren't a community like what we call the colonies in Nebraska and places in the West. They are still a community of friends and associates. They are as we call it, a fan club. And we get to learn that. And the only way I really learned this was through those papers. Despite all the other research I had done on my great-grandfather, and I'd actually done quite a bit, and I had a lot of oral history. At the same time, I learned an immense amount of information about his social world from from those papers, and then the papers of the next set of people that I became connected to. It became a yellow brick road for me. Sorry.
Love it.
I'm good.
No, that's fine. Denise and then Lyle.
Yeah.
Go
Just
ahead,
to echo
Lyle.
whatever. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go
Just to echo what everyone has said, it's about the contextualization, not only for genealogy, but for history. And this opens up a larger conversation surrounding Black land ownership, late 19th century, as we go into the 20th century. And it's so important because we're telling our stories within the context of American history.
Yes.
Absolutely. Denise, you're muted. Go ahead.
Well, for me, it's so important to know this, not only to know it from the historical point of view, but for today, to pass it down to our children, to our grandchildren. I didn't know any of this growing up. I did know I had another grandfather who paid cash, and he had to pay $300, like 1896, to purchase some land. I did know that. But my family didn't know, like I wrote about Peter Hunt in Mississippi. They didn't know anything about him. This man was the son of a slave and a slave owner. And he looked white, like I said, and he joined the colored troops. And then after that, he homesteaded some land. Well, once he homesteaded over 157 acres, then his mother turned around and she homesteaded. But as I was putting my notes together last night, her children, her daughters, they married men who homesteaded. Her grandchildren married, her granddaughters married men who homesteaded. One of her grandsons homesteaded. Then one of my great uncles, it was actually his third wife, but come to find out, her first husband, he homesteaded and owned his land. So when they broke up, she went back to her own property. But the fact is that all of these people knew one another.
Sure.
And I have so many new cousins now today that I didn't know about it until I looked at this homestead information. And Bernice, helping me out, getting the paperwork and everything. It come to find out, not only was Peter married to the third woman, but it turns out I met the elderly lady who was her great aunt. And she turned out and told me how I was related to that side of the family. And it wasn't by blood. And it's just amazing. And then of course you get your homestead documents and you're reading them. And then it's like, oh my God, all these people were interconnected some type of way. And I'm thinking, well, how did Peter meet that third woman, Rebecca? Well, her grandson married one of Peter's relatives. So, and I'm thinking, oh my God, there is so much history here. The people that live on Peter's land now, they had no idea who he was. They thought, maybe grandpa or great grandpa bought the land, but it didn't. Peter did. And so I met the lady over the phone and she just was flabbergasted that she was reading my book at the time, that was her great grandfather. And then I met another man who was Peter's third great grandson. Turns out he was the mayor of a little dinky town in Mississippi. And it was right almost at the same spot where Peter was a slave. So you begin to see on all these documents how you're all interconnected. One of my other elderly cousins, he says, well, I read the story. He said, my cousin was married to that man you wrote about. So, I mean, it's just incredible. And I really won't go into the secrets and the discoveries, but there was a myth out there and it was through oral family history, but you've got to check that. You've got to check all your documents right along with the homestead documents so you can get a full and complete picture of the family life at that time. So the elderly lady that I met, which turned out to be my aunt, great aunt, I promised her before she died that I would solve that problem that nobody seemed to be able to answer. And it was through the homestead documents. So that will come up a little later on, but it's just, I think, like I said, I can't thank Bernice enough to make me take a look, not only at the homestead documents, but then to look back at what I had already researched about my family. And they're cousins I haven't met yet, but we talk, we email, we text. And so I'm elated about that. So
Awesome.
thank you.
So Bernice, I have a question for you, and it's coming from Vicki McGill in the audience. Just share the steps on people to get started on doing this.
Okay, the first thing that you will need to do is to go back to your own genealogy. You know, sometimes stuff is looking you right in the face and you don't even
Right.
see it. Go back and re-look at your census records. See if
Right.
anyone is listed as a farmer. Of
Mhm.
course, you want to go back to those states that I mentioned, all of those homesteading states. And somebody wanted me to put the map back up, so I'll put it back up for you.
Yes, that's Regina.
Yes. I have to stop sharing so I can put it back up. I hope it comes back up. It doesn't want to come back up, folks.
You have to get out and get back in.
Yeah,
Okay.
just, there you go.
I'm back. Okay. Study this map. Think about this map. Were your ancestors, and they didn't necessarily have to be in the South. They could be in Arizona, New Mexico, California. Look at this map. I really want to see you folks from Missouri and Oklahoma and Michigan and Idaho telling your stories, because that's one of the things that you want to be able to do is first look at where those homestead states were located, and then go back to your own genealogical research and see what's in there. The next step is to look for the land patent. Go to the Bureau of Land Management. In the Bureau of Land Management, you will find when the land was acquired. You will find the number of acres. You will find an application number and a patent number. With that information, and you will also find the land office where they file. With that information, you can then request your land entry papers through the National Archives and Records Administration. And those records will cost you $50. Now, I have seen files as small as 5 and as large as 42. So understand, you may get a tiny file and you may get a big file. But what you find in that file is information that you would not get anywhere else, because you will find that person is actually stating when they were born, how old they are, where they were born. And I was so happy when I saw my ancestor. He gave his age and he said, I was born in Louisiana, of which I knew because I got a long list of people from Louisiana. But then he went on to talk about when he settled on the land. And when he settled on the land, I really saw that this man was on this land for 10 years, 10 whole years before he even got his patent. You're going to find some stories where they've been on that land for 12 years before they got their patent. But this is information that, as I said, you would not get anywhere else. And when you start looking at those witnesses, I have this thing about the witnesses, folks. Follow the witnesses. Because I followed all of the witnesses for my ancestor and found out that all the children started marrying each other. Yes, the homesteader children started marrying each other. So you look at generational wealth right there. Are you looking at a community of people that really understand what it means to own land and to do what they had to do? So once you get your land entry papers, study the papers, and then there's a template on the Descendants of African-American Homesteaders Facebook page. If you don't have it, I'll send it to you. But you could start writing your story. It's just prompts. Writing your story from the prompts. Of course, there's background information that you will have already, but you're adding to your story, because then your story, along with your land entry papers, can then be submitted to the Homestead National Historical Park. And everybody on this page, they have stories on that website. So now we have a parallel book. We have the Black Homesteaders of the South book, but you also have your stories on this government website. And we're looking for more stories. We're trying to get more stories, and I think a couple of stories are going to hit tomorrow. But this is one of the things that the Homestead National Historical Park has made as one of their major projects to identify Black homesteaders. And in a couple of years, we're going to have this big celebration about the Homestead Act. Now, I want you all to know, can you imagine going to the park, clicking a map, let's say Louisiana, and all of your ancestors pop up and their stories? Well, this is what we want to see throughout the public land states. We want to see stories from everywhere. And I'm going to tell you one other thing. I want to see some of those Missouri stories. I want to see those Arizona stories, Arizona, the Oklahoma. Each of us could write a book about our whole ancestors. This book is just kind of the beginning. Let's see some additional books come out. And I want to mention that this book is published by the History Press of Arcadia Publishing. And they believed in what we had to say. And they agreed to publish our book and our stories.
So let me ask a quick question, Angela. When you talked about the process, Vanessa said, how long did that process take from application to patent?
They had to have a minimum of 5 years. Unless they made the decision to buy the land. So if they're telling you, come back in 5 years and prove to us you did what you said you did. Okay. That's what that's all about. If you're cultivating the land for 6, 7 seasons, that's not 1 year. But that's part of it. Plus you had to build a dwelling. And you want to see what kind of dwelling did they have. And they described the dwelling. They describe animals. I mean, they tell you the works. And this is the part that's so exciting because you go, wait a minute, he had what? You know, I'm reading a record 9. The guy had 2 mules. He had 14 cows. I'm like, what? Where did he get all of that money from? Yes. But this is something that you learn when you start reading. You start asking all kinds of questions. What was really going on back then? And how did they manage to stay landowners without the whole Jim Crow and other things happening around them? And that's part of history that we need to continue studying. And I would love to see the historians delve into this, because you know what? We've seen the Little House on the Prairie story. We've seen the series. Okay, now we need to see the Little House in the bayou or whatever. See those stories.
Angela?
I want to say that I think one of the things is I was giving that sort of, the metaphor of, the forest and the trees, or can't see the forest with the trees. I think that sometimes we as family researchers, we get caught up into not being able to see the forest because we're looking at only our family, only our ancestors, and that's it. But it's kind of like looking at a census page, especially now with digitization, we zoom in, oh, there's the family, and we may crop that out and save that, and put it in the scrapbook or put it on display at the family reunion. But we've got to zoom out and look at the whole page and then start to flip through it and look at the whole community, because that moves us from one level to a very significant part, because we have been victims many, many years of many, many things. And I think that this project is a perfect example of how we can erase something that is not true, or something that is not true can be defined as a lie. Well, this is erasing a lie, because the lie that we never had anything, that we were only sharecroppers, that's not true. This effort is saying, wait a minute, what's the lie? The lie is that, well, we were sharecroppers or only sharecroppers, but that comes through a larger lie, because you can lie by omission. If that's the only narrative you hear, then the listener is going to make a very, very, very almost dangerous assumption that we had nothing, we did nothing, we acquired nothing, we initiated nothing, when the very opposite is true. I think, as Denise Gridge was pointing out, here's this community, and these people have relationships with each other. this is a community where people interacted. And even looking at names, I heard my grandmother talk about the Dillahunties. And then I looked at the land entry paper and wait a minute, Clarence Dillahunty was a witness. Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. And I think we can erase that lie of omission by dealing with the omitted and bringing forth a brand new truth. And this is what I think that Bernice has done with this. Bernice has inspired many of us to start writing our own stories. Bernice has pushed me into another project as well. But it's important because, and I know Margot is busy too. And, I'm thinking, okay, Lyle, when are you coming forth with a whole Arkansas book? I mean, all of these things have to happen. And I just think that I think even in terms of genealogy, we've got to move just beyond our personal family tree and get to the community and erase the lie of omission because we were omitted. In our mindset, we only have an image of sharecroppers. Then the Great Migration came and we became urban city dwellers. There's more to our story than that. And Absolutely. It's an incredibly rich story. And we become empowered by that. This is very empowering. And even I know just sharing some things that I had found in the land entry papers about great Uncle Irving, and even family members are like, what? Are you kidding me? And again, this is unknown. These are, some of the cousins that moved up to Michigan and other parts of the country who actually think that they're from there. No, you're not. We started out in Southwest Arkansas, and it's a very unique story. And there's so many communities because of this effort. And I think that the enormity of what I think Bernice has done, it goes beyond, yes, the family farm. It goes towards a movement, but also towards something that's happened across the board in our families. So we have a lot to tell. And, I just say it's an honor to be a part of this.
And we just have a few more questions, and absolutely, the importance of land ownership really is just as important today as it was back then. And also, you guys, for folks in the audience, think about this. That Homestead Act was 1862. There were folks, African-American, men, women, whoever, during the Civil War, filing to get these patents, this land ownership. This is the wartime, wherever they're at, whatever the states are. And that's why it's more important for us to keep telling these stories. So let me get through these next couple of questions. What percentage, this is from Crystal, what percentage would you say of descendants have found missing information on the land entry papers that they had not found any other place, such as names of family, dates, births, deaths, and other information? I think Denise commented on that. I think Margot commented on that. Or Reese, did you find anything, additional information that you didn't know? And I'm going to say, Dr. Clark, you too. Okay. Go ahead.
Quite recently, actually, I just got a land entry paper for my ancestor, Mary Thompson. And unfortunately, she passed away during her process, her 5-year process to get this land. And her children were able to continue on and get the land. So that process took about 20 years to answer that question that was actually from my mom, Vanessa Jenkins, about how long the process might take. It took 20 years because all this happened. But there's an affidavit in the land entry papers where her son, Green Thompson, lists her actual date of death, which just passed actually. So I'll mention November 15th, 1888 is when she died. And for a Black person in rural Alabama in 1888 to have a death record for her, that doesn't happen in a burned county, by the way. So all the 3 counties that I've researched for this book are burned counties where there's a lot of record loss in the courthouse because of courthouse fires and courthouse flooding in Coffee County, Alabama. So this was really valuable information. It also included a list of all of her descendants, all of her living children
Priceless.
and living grandchildren.
Yes.
And I found very unique information in every land entry paper, but that's the most amazing one that I just had to talk about because I can't even believe it.
Dr. Clark.
Yes. Well, mine was kind of circuitous through a marriage record of my grandfather, great grandfather, and grandmother, John Henry and Frances Kiles. There was a Peter Eddings and a Harry Eddings listed on the marriage record. And that led me to find a whole neighborhood of not only homesteaders, but relatives who also were witnesses for each other. And if I can just show a quick image again,
Sure.
just to demonstrate what Margot talked about and what Bernice talked about, all these places with the dots on them are not only homesteaders, but relatives, and they were all witnesses for each other. And so amongst all of these witnesses and relatives, Harry Eddings was on my grandfather's marriage record as a witness. Peter Eddings was listed as the home where they got married. And I wouldn't have had those names to search out any other way other than seeing that marriage record. But my curiosity, because of John Henry Kiles and his homestead, led me to say, I wonder, were there other family members on my great-grandmother's side of the family that were homesteaders? And you can see all of this land and all of these people, they're all connected. And as we were talking about the communities, and my relatives were in Geneva and Coffee County, Alabama. And coincidentally, a lot of my research and Orisa's research intersected many times, and we found relatives in common. But all of this is to say that they didn't do it by themselves. It was a community effort. It was the friends, the associates, and neighbors that became family, because children of these ancestors did marry and became very large families within the community. So my research is still continuing because of this, and I know it will continue because there's so many other relatives that I have to seek out their land record papers and to see what stories unfold within those papers as well.
Okay, great. So for you all doing your research, how do you figure, or was anyone able to figure out why a certain location, and this is coming from Doug in the audience, how did some of your homesteaders you've worked with actually choose or find the location to move to? Did they tend to move in family groups or units together to the homesteading land? Does anyone have an example they can share on that?
I'll just add the fact that my homesteader and both my great-grandfather and Uncle Irving, they never moved. They got land exactly where they had lived, enslaved. In fact, the parcel of land, when I was on that History Geo site, which I think was the map that was just shared, that Dr. Mary just shared, right adjacent to my family land was the land of Henry C. Pride. He was the slaveholder. And so they were right there. They acquired land right there. They didn't leave and go and find new land. They saw the land, saw it was available, and seized the opportunity.
Same thing with my ancestor, was born in St. Helena and Livingston Parish, and the land that he acquired is in that exact same location. And so speaking of what happens when you start really looking at your files, one of the homesteaders served as a witness to my grandmother when she got married. And I found his name in the family Bible. And I reached out to my mother, who is this person? And she said, oh, a family friend, but he is in the family Bible. And so you start finding all of these connections. I saw he also participated as a witness on a USCT pension file. I mean, you just see all of this stuff because one of the things that everyone needs to understand, you have lots of records to look at. You have the Freedmen Bureau, you have the USCT, you have the bank records. Look at all of those records to help you tell your story. Because then when you get your land entry papers, you see the even bigger picture. And that's how I have chosen when I start my research. I look at the records that we all know about and see what I can find in those records. But the land entry papers, now the homestead, that's kind of my go-to place. I always look for land now. And this is one of the things that I hope everyone will do. Look for land, look for it. You may find somebody with the same name. Research both people to determine if it's your ancestor, because I have had files. I've had individuals request records and it wasn't their ancestor because they grabbed the name and didn't do the research. So you still have to make certain that you do the research to definitely say this is in no doubt my ancestor, because you're going to find other people listed on that record to help you determine whether you're not that record, but other records to help you determine if that is your ancestor.
Okay, I'm going to say one question, then give each of you a chance for any parting words if you'd like to wish any or give out any. But there was a question by Kathleen. Was Greenwood, Oklahoma? So that's a very specific. So I'm going to say, was Oklahoma settled by Black homesteaders? And if anyone wants to respond as far as the state of Oklahoma, which doesn't become until 1907, and the Homestead Act, ended at 1970s? Something 76, I think is what it was, or something. But anyway, that was the specific question. I don't know how you can answer as far as Greenwood, Oklahoma. So I'm just saying, was Oklahoma one of the homestead states?
Okay.
Which it was.
I can answer that since I'm an Oklahoma researcher. And a lot of the lands in Oklahoma, many people get a little bit confused because those who had been enslaved by the 5 tribes, we're talking the 5 tribes that were forced to the West in the 1830s and 40s from the Southeast, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole nations that are now, of course, rooted in Oklahoma and based there. Those tribes were also known as the so-called 5 civilized tribes. And one of the reasons, because they had embraced some aspects of European culture, including enslavement of African people. At the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the Dawes Act had been put into place, which was an act of redistributing land to the people who already owned the land, because within these 5 tribes, the native people, as well as the freed people, the freedmen, as they were called, tribal freedmen, Cherokee freedmen, Choctaw freedmen, they were going to have the concept of private land introduced, because prior to that, land was held in common. Everybody owned the land. So my cows could graze in your pasture, your cows could graze in my pasture. But now this concept of private parcels of land was being introduced to the tribes that once had held land in common. That meant that everyone went through a process, and this is what the Dawes role was created for, not to join the tribe. They were already in the tribe. Freedmen had been slavery was abolished in 1866 under the premise that not only does slavery end, but the freed people are citizens now of those 5 nations. And although there were different degrees in terms of how that was reacted to, but nevertheless, we're talking about freed people. They all received land allotments prior to statehood. Between 1898 and 1914, you can find the Dawes, D-A-W-E-S, named after Henry C. Dawes of Massachusetts, who wrote the resolution in Congress. But the Dawes cards was the beginning of a process for land allotment to receive it. everyone received allotments, including babies. Infants received allotments as well as elders. And allotment sizes varied from tribe to tribe. So people received from 40 acres up to 160 acres, up to 320 acres per person. Apart from all those allotted lands, 91,000 people received millions of acres. But beyond that, there was a lot of public land as well. And there are people who came into Oklahoma and started, there was the Oklahoma land rush of 1889, and people came in from other states. And there were people of African descent part of those land rushes. There was another land rush in 1891, and so on. Now, Greenwood, what that people refer to, is not a town. Greenwood is a neighborhood in Tulsa. Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. It's the neighborhood that was destroyed and burned by an angry white mob. It was a self-sufficient neighborhood, and it was destroyed in 1921. You've heard of the Tulsa Massacre. But many people who lived in Greenwood, some were from the 5 tribes that moved to Tulsa, maybe for work. Some had maybe lost their land over the years and it moved to Tulsa. But it was also full of state people who had migrated to Oklahoma. But Greenwood is a neighborhood, about 3,000 or so homes were really burned to the ground. But outside of what is the city limits of Tulsa are all these allotted lands. And I'm working on a project, Justice for Greenwood, and we're seeking to identify people who are descendants of survivors of the Tulsa massacres. And among those that we are researching and chronicling are many who are descendants of freedmen, also who had allotted lands. But the allotted lands of the freed people in the 5 tribes are not homesteaders. They were allottees because they belong to a particular nation.
Their nation.
There are, however, Black folks who migrated to the state of Oklahoma, and you hear about the Black towns. There's Bowley, there's Langston, there are several other, well, there are almost 50 Black towns, many of whom acquired land through the Homestead Act, and they are homesteaders in Oklahoma. And I'll put in a little side note, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, which is a neighborhood in Tulsa. Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, you've heard of the Gap Band. They were young men who were from Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, which is where that name came from, but because they were from Tulsa. And but Greenwood was the neighborhood that was destroyed in the massacre of 1921. But outside of that, there are homesteaders all over Oklahoma of African descent.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, Dorothy Barth, I believe you have your hand up. If you can put that question in the chat, because if not, I cannot see you to unmute you. And but I'd like to know what your question is. And unless you can unmute and just ask your question, because I want to give the panel time for them to give a brief takeaway that they would like for folks about reading their stories and things to say. So if she is there, I can, because I couldn't send her a message either.
Does she have to put
Dorothy?
her question in the Q&A or in the chat?
No, it's not in there. She had her hand raised, and so I can't see it. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Her hand is still raised. I do want to make a comment from Deidre Crumbly. Your excellent Black homesteader rewrites history with our stories finally included. So thank you. And I'm saying that's probably reaching out to every one of you that are authors there. She said, but it also makes me question, and this would have been followed up by what Angela would have been just talking about. She said, how is our homestead history connected to Native American connection to land? So basically, from what I heard, what you talking about, Oklahoma, Indian Territory and stuff would have, responded to some of that. And what she said, connection to the land and how we might respond to it in terms of collaborative social justice efforts today. And I'm gonna say my whole background is actually housing besides genealogy, and the same issues with housing and I'm saying issues go on today in 2022 that they would have been on in the 1800s, late 1800s, especially as far as affordable home ownership and this, that, and other discrimination and all of that. Those type things are very active today, alive. There's problems with housing and for people to acquire, which makes you reflect back on this Homestead Act of 1862 and that opportunity that was afforded to people in this country was so critical because land was also survival. And it was also something that people really couldn't take away. They did, and there were attempts, but basically our ancestors that were homesteaders also had a position per se, and I'm saying it in society as a homesteader. That rings very prevalent today as African Americans owning their home or owning their land. And so just as a memory, that's a whole nother conversation, but I want to ask each of you if you have any parting takeaways you want to share briefly, and we'll go from there and then we'll end this. And I'll come back to Denise first, if you can unmute and give, if you have a takeaway.
Well, like I said, with Bernice starting this entire project, it gives us such a wonderful knowledge and realization that, like someone else had said, we weren't just sharecroppers or floating through the wind and getting beat up and whatever. And my biggest takeaway is my third great grandmother. She was a slave. She was forced to have children by the slave owner. She couldn't, do what she needed to do with her own husband, and there are church records where he got put out of the church because he was forever doing something, in retaliation. So you begin to see what our ancestors had to go through for us. We have no right to not do anything or not achieve something. We don't have that right. And through all of this, my nephews and nieces, they're so confident in who they are and who their ancestors were, that it's just, we really need to put this out there because they're not going to teach it in school. They're not going to teach it in high school, and they're trying to get it out of colleges. So we have to do it. And I'm more than willing and able to do it while I can. And I'm so proud of my ancestors, including my third great grandmother. She didn't get her property until she was 72. From the life she had to lead from being born into slavery to finally getting her own, living in a square 16 by 16 log cabin. So I'm so proud of her. And I want to know more. And I know there's more out there. So do this. If at all possible, you should do this, not only for yourself, but for your family and for others. Thank you, Bernice.
Thank you, Denise. Lyle, and then Margot.
Yeah, my takeaway, if I can, it contextualizes so much. When I reached out to Bernice to order my first patent records, it was for Gideon Murphy, pictured here with his wife Alice. He had a brother, Reuben Murphy. They are the nephews of my fourth great grandmother. And that family first came to Southwest Arkansas around 1820. And so it really just helped me to, once again, contextualize things, want to learn more, and even looking at some of the other land patents that I ordered. I'm hearing Dr. Clark mention Coffee County, Alabama. My Frank Crittenton, the brother of my second great grandmother, got land in Dale County. And so that was a neighboring county, but some of my folks moved to Coffee County. So, now we have these potential connections of neighbors and things like that. So I just think it's a wonderful experience. I would encourage people to just go ahead and take a dive, order the records. Sometimes they may hold a wealth of information. Sometimes they may just be very basic to the land, but it's still important to help you contextualize information.
Okay, Margot and then Dr. Clark.
Yeah, I have to echo the things that everyone has said. My takeaway is to go back over, since I had my documents for so many years, but really hadn't gone back and looked at them carefully. Go back over documents that you have in your research that maybe you haven't looked at in a while. And yes, go back and look at those census records and see, are they marked that you have landowners in your family? And then begin to pursue whether or not you have homesteaders, and realizing that we are a part of and celebrating and making sure your children and grandchildren and cousins and everyone understand we are a part of that larger picture that we're always trying to stake a claim to. We have that claim already. We are part of that American history. We are part of the settling and the moving forward of this country. We were there. We were there. We were not only being acted upon, but we were agents in our own right. And sometimes we forget that. And Bernice can tell you that there were professional historians who doubted that we owned land in the South. I'm like, where were you studying that you didn't understand that at least some of us, the extent to which we owned land? I don't think anybody realized that. And part of that, again, because there's no mention of race in the homestead records, I think that that has escaped everyone's attention. But we can go in and help write that, write, W-R-I-T-E, and write, R-I-G-H-T, that story. And really contribute a significant piece to the writing of American history.
I agree totally. Dr. Clark, then Maurice and Angela.
Thank you. I would say to those listening in to our stories today, thank you. But I would also encourage you to be a student. And it's always been said that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yes.
Consider us as your teachers of the history of your ancestors. Benefit from the stories that we have found, which are all very different, all very varied, and all unique. You have those stories in your family as well. If you saw on that map that you had ancestors from any of those homestead states, begin searching, begin asking questions, be curious, and see if you can find maybe a picture that has been on the wall of your home or your family's home for many years, like I did, and then honor the lives of those ancestors for what they did. My final words, I just want to say the names of my ancestors, Willis and Dolly Kiles, who started this in our family, and John Henry and Frances Fanny Eddings Kiles, and all the other homesteaders whose stories are waiting to be told. Please tell their stories. Thank you.
Maurice.
I just want to say I'm so proud of this book, and I'm going to hold it up right now because I have it with me. What we're doing with this book is we're combating the erasure of Black accomplishments and progress that we were able to get together and do right after being enslaved. And I think I wrote 3 stories in this book. 2 of them were people that were formerly enslaved. The third person was born in 1866. So he wasn't, but his mother almost certainly was. And it's, I didn't learn about any of this. I didn't even learn about Reconstruction in school. The things that we were able to accomplish during that period right after slavery, they just skipped straight to Jim Crow. But and they try to put out the messaging that we didn't try to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, like they always say, but we were certainly trying, and some of us were succeeding in a really big way. And I just want to end by just reading the last sentence of my Stephen McCaskill story. Stephen McCaskill is the great-grandfather of Whitney Houston and Dionne Warwick, and he is my relative and a homesteader. I just want to say, I wrote, it is unlikely that he would have imagined the success of his descendants when he first submitted his homestead application in 1894, but his determination and intellect paved the way for his offspring to become global icons of the late 20th century. So there's just awesome
Beautiful.
possibilities with this, and thank you
Yes.
all for being here.
Angela? You're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. I wanted
Yeah.
to sort of reemphasize what Margot had mentioned, and she pointed out that race was not mentioned. And because race is not mentioned, there's no database where we can sort them. And let's pull out the Black Homesteaders. Now we can't do that. But there's also, as Aris and Dr. Mary and others have mentioned, there is the fact that we have been omitted. But that is probably, again, an erroneous misspoken assumption. And I think what this book has done is contributed to the effort of erasing that lie of omission. And we have also sometimes been participants in that lie of omission because we have so assumed that what was normal, acquisition of land, did not involve us. And I'm hoping that this book and other books to come forth will move us from making the assumption that the norm is not including us. When we are the norm, we are part of what is the norm. And I hope that others will realize there's probably a story omitted in your community. I'm addressing that, and another project in Oklahoma, and this effort in terms of homesteaders, I think, is major in terms of moving us away from the erroneous assumption that what was the norm did not involve us, and it did. And I can only say, thank you, Bernice, for just spearheading it. I don't even think you knew that you were doing this. You were leading and creating a movement, but you have, and it's right on time. Thank you.
Beautiful. Bernice, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, for my last word, I want to say that stories are still being collected. Stories are still being posted on the National Historical Park site. And this is kind of make this your go-to site to see those stories. And then understand that part of what happened with this whole Homesteader project is that the History Press agreed to publish our stories. And there are more stories out there. And I want to encourage everyone, please join the Descendants of African Americans Homesteaders Facebook group. Also, one of the things that I do, you have this thing called brag. I brag about every single homestead story that's written. And I post it all over the place. And the goal of posting is to educate and create awareness so that you could know if they could do it, you can do it too. So I just want to encourage all of you, purchase the book, tell us what you think about the book, but also tell your story.
I want to thank everyone for coming, the audience. Awesome, great questions, panelists, authors, all of you. I thank you. I think it was very informative. I hope more stories are coming. I want to thank Arcadia Publishing or the History Press for being able to recognize how valuable this is, not only to African Americans, but to America. So appreciate what you have done, what you have shared. Looking forward to a next webinar that might be coming up after opening. And I want to say thank you from the International African American Museum and wish everyone a great day.